Welcome everyone to today's Evidence for Inclusion event. My name is Montserrat Bustelo, and together with Karen Martinez and Claudia Martinez, who is one of our panelists today, we coordinate the GE Lab. The GE Lab is an initiative of the IDB focused on generating rigorous knowledge around gender and diversity issues. Our mission is to promote, lead, and fund top research to boost inclusion and equity in Latin America and the Caribbean. Since GE Lab started in 2020, we have seen significant progress. With the support of Canada and France, we have funded 5 proposal calls, leading to the publication of 7 studies, and with an additional 19 currently in progress. To formulate effective policy, we need solid evidence on what works and what doesn't in closing gender and diversity gaps. This is particularly relevant for women, indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, the LGBTQ+ populations, and persons with disabilities, the focus of our workshop today. Now, I'll hand over to Susan Duria. She's a principal specialist at the IDB's Gender and Diversity Division and leads the Disability Cluster. She's also today's session moderator. Over to you, Susan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Montse, and welcome everyone to what promises to be a very interactive webinar today. Before we begin, I'm going to introduce our panelists. We have Christiane Germain, who is a postdoctoral researcher at University College London. Her research focuses on inequality and the distributional consequences of labor markets.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Christiane. And we have my colleague, Claudia Martinez, who is a lead economist in the research department here at the Inter-American Development Bank. Claudia's research is very wide-reaching. Much of her research agenda focuses on disability inclusion. So welcome to both of you today. We're very happy to have you.
Thanks, Susan.
So for our audience online, I just want to remind you that we're very eager to have your comments and your questions. We'll be responding in the Q&A at the end of the webinar. We'll also be posting some of the links to the articles that we're discussing here today. And we're here today to be able to discuss with these rockstar researchers. We want to explore rigorous research and what we've learned from rigorous research about the equity, well-being of people with disabilities in Latin America. And to make this conversation more exciting, more interactive, we're going to have the conversation in the format of a game. The game is going to be more facts, more myths, or more facts. So I'm going to say a set of statements that are commonly understood in the region to be about people with disabilities. These are like commonly held views about people with disabilities. And then I'll ask our panelists to give us insights. You know, was this statement factual, or is there more nuance here that we need to understand? So we're thrilled to have our experts with us here today. We also want to know what you think about these statements, what strikes you as more myth or more fact. And so please put that in the chat so that your views count. So are we ready?
Yes.
Okay. So our first statement is the following. Over time, the percentage of people with disabilities in Latin America and the Caribbean will decrease. Is this more myth or more fact? Christiane, what are your thoughts about this statement?
Thank you. I think it's more a misconception. So the World Health Organization estimates that today we have 1.3 billion people in the world that live with some form of disability. And this is about 16% of the overall population. And in the region of the Americas, the estimate is about 20%. Now, I'm talking about estimates. I'm not talking about precise numbers because in a lot of countries, information on disability is not even collected on surveys. But I can give you an example of a country in the region that collects information on disability, and this country is Brazil. So in the demographic census in 2010, there were questions asking people to respond whether they face challenges in hearing, seeing, walking, climbing stairs, or if they have a permanent intellectual disability. And it turns out that among people who are aged between 25 and 54 years old, I'm talking about the working age population, 22% of them reported living with some disability, and 7% live with severe disability. And I think this number is expected to increase even more in the next year because of the demographic trend, decline in mortality, and the increase in chronic health conditions for the overall population. So that's why I think it can be a myth.
Thank you so much. So you say myth. Claudia, what are your thoughts on the statement?
First, I would like to take like one moment. So recognizing that we just had the Nobel Prize of Economics gave to Claudia, and I think it's an amazing news because of the research that she has done on female neighborhood participation, inclusion, wage gap, and it's very in line with the research that we do at GD Lab. So regarding the statement, I agree with Christiani. It is false. In the region, we have the estimation that we have is that about 90 million people have a disability. And as the population ages and disability is correlated with aging, the estimations that we have is that that number is going to increase to about 150 million by 2020. So these are big numbers. We're talking about 15% of the population, 20% of the population. Therefore, we should think that disability is not like a niche problem or a marginal issue. It's a lot of people, and we should be thinking about policies to improve the life of people with disabilities, from early diagnostic to inclusion and support at school, transition to work, support at work, and pension disabilities for those that can engage in work.
Thank you very much, Claudia. And I completely agree with both of you. And having contributed to these projections, I don't want to contradict them, but I just want to add a little bit of nuance. So these projections take into account the aging of the population in the region and keep constant age-specific prevalence rates of disability. We know that disability is defined as the interaction between impairments and barriers to participation in society. These projections did not take into account the possibility and the hope that over time we'll be reducing these barriers and that age-specific prevalence rates may decline over time. So hopefully that's what we're here to do, and we'll see that in our lifetime. Our next statement is more myth or more fact?
Sorry, can I add to
Yes,
your statement? So I
course.
think it's super relevant, and thank you for bringing it up, that like the disability definition, it has two components. So one is the impairment that we might have, and second are the barriers. So public policies should aim to both, to decrease the impairments through early diagnostic, support, etc., but also decreasing barriers. And some of the barriers are like visible, like if I can't see well and I use glasses, like the barrier is almost disappear. And some are, or if I use a wheelchair and there isn't a ramp, like I'm cleaning and decreasing or eliminating the barrier, but some of the disabilities are not seen so easily, like for example, individuals in the autism spectrum, which also have some barriers I should be considering. So thinking about policies in both arms, I think it's crucial.
Thank you, Claudia. Yes, and barriers can also be attitudinal, such as discrimination against people with disabilities. Okay, so our next statement is most children in school with disabilities do not attend school. And again, we're thinking of Latin America and the Caribbean here. So audience, what are your views on this? Is this something you think is mainly true or not? For this, I'm going to go back to Claudia for your insights.
So I'm going to give an economist answer. It depends. So if we think about students or children in primary school, it's mostly false. So overall, in the region, we have the completion rates of primary school that are close to 100% for children without disabilities, but with children with disabilities, about 2/3 that. And that gap increases, so it's larger in secondary school and it's much larger in tertiary school. On the other hand, I think it's very important to consider what is the quality of education that the students are receiving. So historically, individuals with disability, children with disability were sent to special education institutions, which might not be the best context for teaching the students with disability. And there's not right now a trend to increase their inclusion in mainstream education, but still, as we've seen in the policy brief that we just wrote, there isn't much evidence of the impact of mainstream and how to make it of good quality for students with disabilities. So we have to consider both the access, but also the quality of education that the students are receiving.
Thank you, Claudia. And Cristiane?
Yes, I agree with all this point. I think one important thing to highlight from the data is that when you look at the data, on average, children with disabilities, they are less likely to complete high school, they are less likely to go to college relative to children without disability. Another fact that is important to highlight is that we have 250 million children with disabilities in the world, but excluding educational opportunity for this population has huge social and economic cost. We know that low educational levels are associated with higher poverty, higher levels of poverty, and higher dependency on welfare programs. And the other thing is, like, there is a discussion about what worked. What Claudia mentioned is what worked in terms if we should have an inclusive environment in which children with disabilities are enrolled in regular schools with children without disability, or if we should have segregated settings in which there are specialized education, specialized schools for children with disability. We don't have a lot of evidence on that. And one potential reason for that is because a lot of educational surveys, they don't collect information on the nature and the level of support that children with disabilities require and which sort of accommodation schools provided. So we need to have more information on that so that we can identify which policies work in terms of promoting inclusion for children with disabilities.
Thank you very much. So what I'm hearing from our experts here is that while this statement is not true, there are many, many issues that require rigorous research so that we can address the pending compelling issues in education to promote inclusive education in the region. Following up on one of the things you said, Cristiane, and it's something that Claudia and I were talking about earlier that we point out in our policy brief. When you look at the rigorous evidence about mainstreaming, you find this curious imbalance that there are 3 to 4 times more studies that look at the impact of mainstreaming, so having students with and without disabilities studying together in the same schools and the same classrooms. The education literature has 3 to 4 times more studies that look at the impact of that on students without disabilities than on the impacts for students with disabilities. And whether that is related to problems with the data or lack of interest, I think is an important question.
I totally agree. And Cristiane was saying, about 10% of children has a disability, and there is a lot of talent there. So we should be thinking how to, like, for 2 reasons: for like an ethical issue and a human rights issue, but also from a productivity reason. We should be thinking on what are the best policies to include them and use and foster that talent. And I agree, it's very surprising, and I have to say a little bit sad that most of the research it's done about the effect on the peers and not in the students with disabilities. And there's no paper in the region.
Okay, so statement 3. Employment quotas produce positive effects on the inclusion of people with disabilities in the labor market. Now, I know this is something that you both know a lot about, so I'm going to give you a little more time here. Christiane, can you give us your thoughts on this?
I think employment quotas can create job opportunities for people with disabilities, and I will tell you why. But just for background, the unemployment rate for people with disabilities in most countries are very high, can be at least twice of the unemployment rate of people without disabilities. And of course, you can think that happens for many reasons. You can think maybe people with disabilities have low educational level or even lack of awareness of disability issues. But what I want to emphasize is that most countries' employers are not willing to hire people with disabilities as workers because of discrimination. So we need to think about more. We need to think more about labor market policy that can incentivize the demand for people with disabilities as workers. And in my work, I study the most prevalence of this policy, which is employment quotas. Just to give you a sense of the size, more than 100 countries have employment quotas for people with disabilities, and it's especially prevalent in Latin America. So you can think on the one hand, employment quotas can create job opportunities for people with disabilities, but on the other hand, it's possible that it can lower some profit or displace people without disabilities because of this new hire with disabilities. This is the position that I attach my work, and I attach in the context of the private sector in Brazil. So Brazil had a reform in 1999 that essentially combined the code of regulation and enforcement. So the code of regulation in Brazil states that the firm with more than 100 employees should have at least 2% of the workforce of people with disabilities, and that's increasing the firm size. And labor inspection are the main enforcement mechanism. So once the firms are inspected and found to be non-compliant with the regulation, they are granted a grace period to either hire more people with disabilities or pay fines. So which means that I can compare firms who have slightly more than 100 employees and they are under code of regulation to those who have slightly less than 100 employees and they are not under code of regulation before and after labor inspection. So here's what I find. I find
before and after they've been inspected.
Yes, I can follow the same firm before and after the inspection, but some firms are required to comply with the regulation because they have more than 100 employees, and some firms are not. So we can compare those firms and see what happens once they're inspected. So here is what I find. First, the firms who are under code of regulation, they hire more people with disabilities, but they hire more into low-paying jobs. And they prefer to hire people from mild disabilities like physical disabilities or hearing impairment. The second finding is that there is no evidence that the firm experienced low profit because of that. And the third finding is that when we look at people without disabilities, there is no evidence that they experience low employment or they experience low wages. And my fourth and last finding is that with the help of a model, I'm able to quantify that the economic gain of creating job opportunity for people with disabilities are much higher than the cost of enforcement, the cost of a labor inspection. So there's two policy takeaways to highlight here. One is that it's not enough to talk about the regulation alone, mostly because a lot of firms choose to not comply with that in the first place. We need to think about the combo of regulation and enforcement. And the second takeaway that I want to highlight is that we can think of enforcing modern employment mandates for people with disability that otherwise they wouldn't have been hired as a way to create job opportunity for them and also increase the aggregate welfare for the economy.
Thank you very much. And Claudia, we've done some work in this area ourselves, so.
Yes. So we analyzed a policy similar to the one in Brazil, but enacted later in 2009, which mandates firms that also have more than 100 employees to have at least 1% of people with disabilities in the payroll. And we also find positive effects. There are more people with disabilities working in firms that are above the quota before and after, like similar identification strategy. So what I would like to add is first that we find that a substantial share of these people with disabilities working are reclassification. And this is something that has found in the literature. This is people that were already working in the firm, and after the law, now they are officially disabled and they keep the same position in the firm. So I think that might not be in the spirit of the law. Probably the law wants having more people with disability working, and what we find is that there are more people hired with disabilities, but also some of them are relabeled. In our paper is a short-term analysis, so we think, but we don't know because we haven't seen the data yet, that is going to have a ceiling, and there's a max amount of people that could be reclassified, and therefore it will be interesting to see what happens in the long run. So I think that's two conclusions there. We find a positive impact, but a fraction of substantial fraction, it's relabeling, which might not be what we want. We also did like a nudge experiment where an experiment is that we send emails to the firms, trying them to make them comply with the law, and that also had an impact. But what we find, it's a bit technical, so I'm gonna go about it very fast. But the effects are a bit different if you nudge them than if you just observe what happened with the law. Third, I wanted to say that I completely agree with Cristiani that it's a combo. It's like the law plus whether you're going to enforce it. And enforcement is a policy choice. So we shouldn't be thinking that enforcement is something that happened. It's something that the government might decide to do or not to do with putting more resources or not putting more resources on it. So another point I want to make is that beside what we have done in Chile, the literature, it's a big mix. So there are some positive impacts. It's mostly in developed countries, with the exception of our papers. It's a bit mixed. So there are some positive impacts in Spain, in Japan, and in Austria. But there are some negative effects in one paper in France, null effects in Germany. And some of this heterogeneity might have to be with enforcement, but also might have to be with the level of the quota. So I think it's pretty different to have a quota of 1%. To a level of quota of 5%, and that's something that we don't know. We don't know what is the optimal level of quota, and I think that's an super interesting question. I forgot what else. Sorry.
No, thank you so much to both of you, and as you're both pointing out, quotas are a very common policy in the region. 20 countries have employment quotas for people with disability, either in the private sector and or the public sector. The quota ranges from 1% to 5%. Sometimes it's binding for every firm. In other countries, it's binding over 50 firms that have 50 workers, other 100, 200 workers. So I think these papers are providing a lot of important evidence on what we know in Chile and Brazil, but there's still a lot of more work to be done.
Yes, for sure. It's highly controversial, and I completely agree that the evidence is very mixed, and it mostly depends on the size of the quotas, but we still don't know what is the optimal level of quotas, and that is an important question for the future.
Great. So our next to last statement is, social protection programs that provide subsidies, monetary subsidies for people with disabilities, improve the quality of their lives. Is this more myth or more fact? Cristiani, I'm going to come to you first.
I'm afraid, no, I'm actually happy to say that it is a fact. Sorry, I'm bad at the microphone, by the way. I'm sorry about that. So it's more a fact. So social protection are really extremely important for people with disabilities. We do have evidence that removing social protection from people with disabilities actually increase poverty for them, increase financial distress, and increase the likelihood of getting involved with criminal activity. And the main reason for that is because for a lot of people with disabilities, the social protection is actually the main source of income for them. And once they lose access to it, they lose the main source of income. And another thing that is important to think about is how to interact social protection with labor market policies. So we do have some discussion that in a lot of countries, in a lot of social programs, the way that we design it it imposes some maximum levels of income, and that can create some disincentive for work. But we do also know that a lot of people with disability, they face a lot of challenges in the labor market. And oftentimes, social protection is not only the only source of income, but even when they work, the income from work is not enough to support the extra cost that they have because of the disability. So we need to think more about the design of social protection that separate the element of the income support from the element of compensating people with disability for the extra cost that they have because of their condition.
Wonderful. Claudia?
So I agree. So subsidies do help people with disabilities, but I would first like to start with with the fact that if we see the literature on social protection, like most of the literature in the beginning was focused on the impact of social protection on the probability of people with disability working or not working. And so what we call in economics the moral hazard of the design of the subsidies. And so when people, maybe like one could ask, like, what is the statement a question? Like if you provide subsidies, you should think like definitely it's going to be an impact, positive income on people with disabilities. So the reason that it is a question is because they, given that you provide a subsidy, they might generate disincentives to work, for example. And the literature has found that that is true. So it does decrease work, it does decrease earnings. But first, that literature it's mostly or all except one paper in developed countries where formal work it's a norm, and it's not in developing countries where we have a lot of informal work. And second, like we have to recognize that there is a fraction for people with disabilities where they could maybe in the margin decide to work, but there's a lot of people with disabilities where they can't work or they can't make enough income by working. So first that so it is a question. There is evidence, so we have to be smart designing the policy, and as Christian said, like how to interact the subsidies with the work policies at the same time, and like how to target. But at the same time, we have to recognize that the research has also shown, and tomorrow we have a workshop on disability, and Manasi Deshpande from Chicago is coming, and she has done a lot of work showing that actually, and not surprisingly, providing subsidies increase the well-being of people with disability in measures such as foreclosure, where they have their house. Other people have shown that they actually increase, the decreases mortality. So they're like a strong indicator that this work, and they have a space. They should have a space in the design of social policies.
Great. So I think we're in agreement here that most of the literature is showing these subsidies do make improvements in people's lives. I mean, we're all excited that the literature is shifting from employment effects, income effects, and looking at these broader quality of life issues, mortality, financial stability. And I think, the next frontier is really to show the effects of these programs on other outcomes, such as autonomy, the ability of people, for self-determination. Many times, this is an objective of social protection for people with disabilities. And the rigorous research really hasn't tackled that yet.
Yes, and also it also reminds me there is a new survey that came out about social protection in developing countries, and there's one specific question that was mentioning that we don't have a lot of evidence for people with disabilities. This is really an important area for future work, and it's also important to think about how to interact social protection with the informal sector, and this is something that we do have this gap in terms of evidence. We don't know much about it. And let's hope that more people can find the right entries.
So that's a great segue to our very last statement, which is about data in the region. So is it myth or fact? There's not enough data to design effective policies for people with disabilities. I'll let you continue on that topic, Christiane.
I completely agree. As a researcher, I have been facing a lot of challenges in trying to work more on issues related to people with disabilities, because in a lot of countries in Latin America, a lot of surveys, they don't ask specifically questions related to disabilities. And I want to emphasize three important things. The first, we need to think about how to include questions on disabilities in a lot of surveys, not just countries, but also labor force surveys, household surveys, and so on. But it's not just enough to ask questions about disability, but it's important to also follow standard measures from international organizations. They're recommended by international organizations. And I want to highlight the work from the Washington Group on Disability Statistics. They have been doing a fantastic work of making these measures available for everyone. And the third thing, it's really important to make sure that the information on disability is being updated frequently, you know. In some countries, this information is only collected every 10 years, but the fact that someone reported in a survey that the person didn't have a disability in 5 years ago doesn't mean that the person doesn't have a disability today. So it's really important to collect this information frequently, so that we can know when the person responds to the survey also align with the moment where the person needs social support, needs assistance from the government.
Great. Claudia, can you give us your insights?
So the half full version of the answer is that we have much more data than we had 5 years ago. Both Christiani and our research has mostly been done, for example, with administrative data, which is like an exciting and new opportunity. And I think it's something that maybe more researchers could use to study different angles of the issues of people with disabilities. And I understand that we have, as a region, more surveys having questions about disability. At the same time, there's a lot to be done. So, for example, we were trying to calculate like the difference in expenditure of households with and without individuals with disabilities, and we only found that one survey in the region has that question. So I think it's not very costly to add this type of questions. The Washington Group questions are not like enormous, so they're easily it's feasible to include them in the different surveys that are done across the countries. And it's very important. So sometimes, like, you want to work with a survey in one country, and then you find that that the question that they have is different to the one that they have in different surveys, and then it's difficult, for example, to compute just the number of people with disability, because it depends on how you measure it, and it's measured well or not well in different instruments. So I think there is still work to be done in harmonizing how the questions are asked and including these issues, the questions about individuals with disabilities in all surveys that are done across our countries.
Well, thank you both for playing this game. Thank you to our audience for playing the game. We're very interested in hearing your thoughts on, given this long list of gaps in knowledge, where should researchers prioritize? But I think we have some questions that we can answer right now. Oh dear. I knew I would do that. Okay. So from the audience, we have a question about young researchers who are interested in doing disability research. What advice or recommendations would you give to aspiring researchers?
I would say do it. There is a lot to learn about this topic. It's not going to be easy. As we have discussed it, a lot of countries, they even don't collect information on disability, but it's getting better over time. There are more data, more reliable, that you can follow people over time. You can compare across countries. If you're not sure if a data set is available, try to reach out to the government to see if they collected this data. If you have an hypothesis that it's not possible to be tested with the data that's out there, collect your own survey, collect your own data, and talk to people with disabilities, talk to families with children with disabilities, talk to policymakers. It's really, really amazing how much you can learn from them. You can take new perspective about this topic. But don't give up. I think don't underestimate how much people are actually interested about it and how important this topic is.
Wonderful. Claudia?
Yes, I agree with Cristiani. I will go back to the numbers that we gave at the beginning. So about 15% of the population has a disability. About 10% of children have a disability. So this is a huge subject. And I hope that this is going to gain track and it's going to become more mainstream in the following years. So there is that there are a lot of interesting questions as we have been discussing. There are a lot of things to be should be researchers should be investigating, and there are like first order questions. So a lot of time in economics we're thinking about the margins, like what if we move this thing a little bit, or what happens. So here we're thinking about like first order questions. So I think it's very relevant, and I agree that. It's very important to talk with individuals with disabilities, organizations, families, because that kind of shows what are the main questions, or what are the main constraints, and where are the policies, what are the most important policies that we should be thinking about. And sometimes there are like very interesting things that are being done by the communities that might be interesting to scale up, to study, to understand the mechanisms, etc.
I agree. I think, it's very important to ensure accessibility for researchers with disabilities. We have many, in the region. Latin America is very strong in terms of economists, microeconomists who have the methodologies to be able to do this type of research. And we have to make sure that, they have the fundamentals, the proper conceptual frameworks in disabilities, so that they're not just picking up a data set and writing a paper that they don't understand the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disability, the definition of disability. And there are some new courses available that can, I think, quickly get them up to speed. But bringing together these communities of people with disabilities, researchers with disabilities, top economists, I think if we work together, we can start closing this research gap and improving the effectiveness of policies for disability inclusion. So thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Cristiani, for your participation today. And thank you for, let me see, I think there might be some more questions here. Okay, so we have another question here. They're coming in. So we have a couple of comments about not only access. So we have lots of students who go to school, but on the quality of access. And that applies not only to education, but other types of infrastructure, what training. Claudia, what can we say about the evidence we have on the quality of programs and the importance of the quality of programs?
Unfortunately, very little. So there is very little research overall. And when I mean research, is when I'm thinking like as an economist, it's causal effects. So if I change this, if I give more accessibility, or if I improve the quality of the teacher, or if I teach them special education, or if I provide some technology, or if I do some therapy at school, or etc. What is the impact of that on the students with disabilities? So we don't have almost don't have causal evidence. So I totally agree that one thing is access, and access by itself is not necessarily gonna have a big impact on the quality of life of people with disability. I think it's a first step, but we need to learn a lot more on how to do it right.
I think one area where we have a little bit of insight, and unfortunately it's about what is one of these mainstreaming papers that is looking at the impacts on students without disabilities, but I think it's giving us a little bit of insight. So in Chile, a program that when they started mainstreaming children with disabilities, you found negative spillovers on the test scores of children without disabilities. But when the government started providing protocols about this and started training teachers and providing resources that accompanied this mainstreaming, all of those negative spillovers disappeared. So that may be a quality issue. Unfortunately, no one has yet studied the impacts on the students with disability. Right. Let me see. Okay.
And again, I want to highlight that it's very important to do this type of research in the region because given that we're more budget constrained than in more developed countries, we have to think about policies that are implemented with the resources that we have, which might be different to resources available in richer countries.
I think there's a couple more questions coming through. Okay. So I think this discussion has been, very, very fruitful. I really thank you both for your participation. One of the areas I think that will be most beneficial is in helping the GD Lab design the call for proposals that should come out next spring. And in this, the GD Lab will be sponsoring research in the region about disability inclusion. So everybody, please put your thoughts in the chat about this, and please stay tuned for the call for proposal for research on disability inclusion. And thank you everybody for participating today.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy that we have had this discussion.
Thank you for the invitation, and I hope there are more debates like this one today.